The history of Christianity is, for the most part, a history of echoes. Echoes that cross centuries, languages, and traditions, repeating and reformulating the same fundamental question: who is God, and how can we know him? From the Syrian desert to the monasteries of the Rhineland, from the halls of medieval universities to modern prison cells, this quest for intimacy with the divine shaped generations of believers. Though often presented as isolated figures in their contexts, mystics, reformers, and theologians were part of a living network of influence and memory. Men like John Calvin did not emerge out of nowhere. They inherited, even if critically, the legacy of mystics like Bernard of Clairvaux, thinkers like Dionysius the Areopagite, and communities like the Brothers of the Common Life. The figure of Bernard of Clairvaux, for example, holds a central place in this chain of transmission. A 12th century Cistercian abbot, Bernard was not only a monastic reformer, but also a deeply Christ-centered thinker. His homilies on the Song of Songs revealed a theology of divine love admired by both Luther and Calvin. Calvin himself, often remembered for his theological rigor, saw in Bernard a key link between the Church Fathers and the Reformation, even calling him the chief witness of truth between Gregory the Great and the 16th century. Luther, in turn, said no other church doctor preached Christ so excellently as Bernard, not even Augustine. But Bernard was not alone. He was deeply influenced by the Christian mystical tradition that traces back to Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, a 6th century anonymous Christian writer who wrote under the name of the Athenian disciple mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles. Dionysius articulated an apophatic theology, an approach insisting that God is beyond any positive concept. For Dionysius, the truest language about God is reverent silence, since any attempt to name the divine is necessarily inadequate. This tradition shaped not only Bernard's writings, but also those of Thomas Aquinas, who cited him over 1,000 times, and deeply influenced the Rhineland mystics, such as Johannes Tauler. Tauler, a 14th century Dominican, was one of the great preachers of interior spirituality. His sermons, translated and spread by the so-called Friends of God, emphasized the need for total surrender to divine grace. Luther, even before breaking with Rome, read Tauler with admiration and later published the Theologia Germanica, a mystical anonymous treatise likely linked to that same spiritual circle. In his preface, Luther wrote that, apart from Scripture and Augustine, no other book taught him so much about God and Christ. Not by chance, Johann Arndt, father of Lutheran pietism, also regarded Tauler, Dionysius, and Bernard as legitimate sources of inspiration. For these reformers, mysticism was not in opposition to doctrine, but its lived depth. In that same spirit, other female voices stand out despite historical neglect. Mechthild of Magdeburg, for instance, writing in Low German in the 13th century, described vivid visions of heaven and hell, so powerful that some scholars believe they directly influenced Dante Alighieri. In the Purgatory, the figure of Matilda may be a literary echo of Mechthild, and Dante's very structure of hell resembles her mystical visions. Bridget of Sweden, centuries later, would produce revelations that became mystical references across Europe. Marjorie Kempis, an English mystic, claimed that Christ spoke to her in the same way he had to Bridget, and that all written in Bridget's books was true. This direct network of influence among women mystics reveals not only their spiritual authority, but also their active role in shaping the Western Christian tradition. Julian of Norwich, another English mystic of the period, is now regarded by many scholars as the greatest of all English-speaking mystics. C.S. Lewis in the 20th century cited her more than any other medieval mystic. Her famous saying, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well," is not naive optimism, but a profound expression of Christian eschatological hope. Thomas Merton, Trappist monk and 20th century writer, recognized in Julian a theological vision of divine love that remains unsurpassed. Her doctrine that love was the meaning of everything echoes centuries later in the letters of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and in the sermons of John Wesley. Wesley, in fact, read and published mystical works in his Christian library, including the practice of the presence of God by Brother Lawrence, a 17th-century barefoot Carmelite. Lawrence emphasized the importance of seeking God not only in liturgical moments, but in every act of daily life. This spirituality of God's constant presence in the ordinary had a lasting impact on evangelical spirituality, becoming a bridge between Catholic mysticism and Protestant devotion. Wesley was also educated, at least indirectly, by the tradition of the Brothers of the Common Life, the same that shaped figures like Erasmus of Rotterdam and Luther himself. From this tradition also came Thomas à Kempis, author of the famous work The Imitation of Christ. Kempis wrote under the inspiration of the Brothers of the Common Life, a lay spiritual renewal movement founded by Geert Groot. The Imitation, with its emphasis on humility, surrender, and union with Christ, was read and reread by generations. Ignatius of Loyola considered it essential reading. John Newton, author of Amazing Grace, credited his conversion in part to reading that book. Dietrich Bonhoeffer read The Imitation the night before his execution by order of the Nazi regime. Lewis also cited it with respect. It is remarkable that this small book, written by a silent monk, has crossed confessions, languages, and centuries. Catherine of Siena, declared a doctor of the Church in 1970, represents another kind of mystic. Her theology, deeply embodied, was inseparable from her political and social action. She wrote letters to popes, kings, and cardinals, seeking reform of the Church from within. She inspired 20th-century figures like Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin, founders of the Catholic worker movement, who combined mysticism with social justice. The same can be said of Hildegard of Bingen, another medieval mystic who was only recognized as a doctor of the Church in 2012. These figures did not merely contemplate God, they turned their visions into concrete action. The Reformation, therefore, was not merely a break with Rome, but also a selective continuation of deep spiritual traditions. Reformers like Calvin and Luther did not entirely reject mysticism, but reinterpreted it. They distinguished between a Christ-centered mysticism, grounded in scripture and grace, and devotional forms they viewed as superstitious or self-centered. The Protestant tradition inherited and adapted elements of Catholic spirituality, especially where it placed Christ at the center and acknowledged human incapacity without the action of grace. It is necessary to understand that Christian faith, throughout history, did not develop through generations of thinkers isolated in ivory towers, but through a communion of saints, men and women, lay and clergy, monastic and urban, who sought to live God's presence in the real world. This network of influences reveals something essential about the Church itself. It is Catholic not only by geographical reach, but by its living memory. Even among the most radical reformers, there are always traces of mystics, doctors, and devotees who came before. The spiritual vision of continuity and memory in the Church. If we want to understand Christianity today, we must revisit these sources, not with nostalgic eyes, but with discernment. What can this millennia-old tradition teach us about prayer, intimacy with God, vocation, and holiness? What remains relevant, and what needs to be reformulated for today? How can we balance reason and mysticism, doctrine and experience, orthodoxy and compassion? This walk of faith is made in dialogue with the past. To deny this is to live amnesically. Rediscovering these voices can renew our spirituality today. Which of these figures did you already know? Which of these influences remain alive in your journey? Consider subscribing to the channel, liking and sharing this video so more people can rediscover this forgotten spiritual heritage. See you in the next video.